Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with Barrett Emerick to talk about his paper on forgiveness and reconciliation. Barrett is Associate Professor of Philosophy at St. Mary's College in Maryland, which is in the United States. And he's kindly agreed to talk to me about his work today and to share the video of this with you all. I hope that you'll find this interesting, and I hope that this unusual format, as opposed to just a lecture, will be more engaging and hopefully more informative than just me talking at my laptop for an hour. Barrett, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be a part of the class.
Great. So let's just dive right in on this chapter about reconciliation and forgiveness. So in the chapter, you say that reconciliation is fundamentally bilateral, meaning sort of between two parties, whereas forgiveness is fundamentally unilateral. So it's sort of one thing that an individual can do without another participating in any way. And you say that it entails transparency and agreement between the wrongdoer and the victim as to the nature of the past wrong or set of wrongs. And it requires that moral repair be made between the two parties. So I guess this raises a number of questions. One has to do with reconciliation with the distant and the dead. Do you think it's possible to have something like a reconciliation with someone who wronged you and then went halfway around the world and you have no way of finding them again, but you still have this sort of sense of grievance? Or for instance, someone who wronged you while they were alive and then died before you had a chance to engage in the kind of reconciliation that you describe in the chapter?
Thank you for that. I think it's a great question, and you're kind of getting at what the impetus was for me to want to write this piece in the first place. I think we use terms like forgiveness and reconciliation interchangeably and to mean different things in different contexts. And I think teasing them apart is really important because they're such kind of intimate and personal features of our lives as moral agents. So for me, the answer to the question is that reconciliation is always describing the state of a relationship that is in some ways active and ongoing between parties that are engaged with each other. So to say that it's bilateral or two-sided is to say that if I've reconciled with another person, we have worked together to get to a state of reconciliation, or we are in the process of reconciling. So I can't reconcile with someone who's not a part of my life in an active way. So that's going to include people that have died or people who are on the other side of the world, as in the example you gave.
What about trilateral cases of reconciliation? So suppose I do something really terrible to your sibling or your best friend, and they don't want to reconcile with me, but you're in this now kind of awkward position where maybe we had some kind of relationship before, and you think that I've made adequate apology, but your friend is sort of saying like, yeah, well, you know, screw that guy, like don't ever have anything to do with him, or even just hasn't said anything at all, but you're facing this difficulty where you want to be protective of your friend or your sibling on the one hand, but you also can see that the wrongdoer has maybe gone some way towards making amends. Would that count as a kind of opportunity for reconciliation as well? And how does that fit into your framework?
That's a great question. And I've not encountered exactly a version of that before. I'm not sure that I would want to call it trilateral as opposed to bilateral. I do think that it's possible. And I don't know that a lot turns on the bilateral, trilateral distinction here. For me, I think part of what I'd want to figure out, and I actually don't know that I have a solid answer to this question right now, is if you wrong my friend and I am angry with you for having done so, it seems like part of what I might be doing, the nature of my anger might be defensive or protective of my friend, or it might be that I feel like I was wronged in some way, insofar as someone that I cared about was wronged. And I think either way, it would be possible for you and I to work to reconcile, even if my friend and you never did. So I think that reconciliation would be possible between us in that case, even if I wasn't the primary victim of wrongdoing. What I would want to think more about is whether the reason why I would be in the right position to need to reconcile is because I was actually a kind of secondary victim, or if I wasn't a victim at all, but my anger, still appropriate, was grounded in a kind of protective or defensive posture on behalf of my friend.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess in a way you can slot this into the Straussonian framework. So, if you're the direct victim or the primary victim, then the hard feelings you might have would be, say, resentment. Whereas if you're a third party, you might have hard feelings like indignation. And so if reconciliation involves giving up hard feelings because it also involves forgiveness, among other things, then it's going to be different hard feelings that are given up, but still there will be that aspect of it.
I think that's exactly right. And so part of what work would need to be done, and this end up might looking pretty similar, like indignation or resentment can be affectively the way that they feel, might feel pretty similar in those cases, but we might want to distinguish them in terms of the nature of the wrong, like the nature of the wrong and the relationship that obtains between the wrongdoer and the victim is going to be the thing that helps to determine what the proper moral emotion is that we're talking about in that case. But it's also interesting. I mean, one of the things that I am sympathetic to, that I talk a bit about in the paper, is the way that so I want to reject a kind of strong atomistic or individualistic view of persons that says that everybody's kind of radically distinct from everybody else. I think that there's a lot to be said for the idea that the relationships that we bear to others just is part of what constitutes the kinds of objects that we are. So if you wrong my sister, like I just am my sister's brother. And so there's a way in which when you wrong her, I think it's plausible to suggest that you're wronging me as well, insofar as I bear that kind of strong identity defining relationship to the primary victim of wrongdoing. Again, that's a thing that it feels like an interesting question to pursue, like whether I'm kind of moving into primary victim territory there, if the self is extended in the way that I'm suggesting, or if I would want to cash it out in the Straussonian terms that you were earlier. And I'm also, as I talk about in the paper, very friendly to Strawson as well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could also have this three-party thing moving in the opposite direction, where the primary victim does forgive and reconcile, whereas their friends say like, nah, that's not enough. Like, I'm not gonna reconcile with the wrongdoer as well. I'm gonna sort of continue to shun them or feel indignation on your behalf, even though you've given up resentment.
I think that that's such an interesting case, and that was that version of that case was one that is operating in the background in this paper for me when I was writing it. I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience or if your students have, but I have definitely been angry on behalf of friends or loved ones past the point where they stopped being angry. And I've then kind of been mad at my friend for not being mad anymore and wanting to say, no, like you should still be mad at that person. They wronged you. And of course, there are all kinds of different important moral reasons that are going to bear on the decision whether to forgive or reconcile. And I'm the main motivation for writing the paper was to create space for someone to be able to forgive without also feeling pressure to reconcile. So I don't right now want to say that I want to ever pressure someone to hold on to anger if it makes sense to them to let go of it. But there are definitely cases in my real life where I have felt exactly that way. And I think those are hard cases that we need a framework to help us be able to think about.
Yeah, okay. So here's another hard case, which I think doesn't come up in the chapter, a case where both parties are wrongdoers and victims. I'm thinking of cases like troubled friendships or fraught marriages where there's patterns of wrongdoing on both sides, maybe the same kind of wrongdoing, maybe different kinds of wrongdoing, and therefore also sort of legitimate resentments by both parties. These seem like relatively common, I guess, in relationships that last a long time because there's so many opportunities to do wrong by each other. And also maybe especially interesting cases when it comes to reconciliation, because you've got to have the sort of transparency and openness in both directions, and the giving up of hard feelings in both directions, and the sort of some new kind of agreement about how we're both going to sort of mend our ways mutually and together at this, maybe even at the same time. Any thoughts about that kind of case?
Just that I think that you're exactly right, that that's a part of the messiness of moral life, is that it's easy when we're philosophizing, thinking about this kind of question, thinking about moral repair, to want to focus just on one particular wrong. Strawson gives the example of someone stepping on my hand, right? And there's no background context about why that happened. And of course, a lot of the, I mean, there are discrete one-off wrongs, but a lot of the time, wrongs that are committed within established relationships have this whole history that you've just described. And so, I don't know, I use the case of infidelity in the paper, of one person cheating on another. Maybe one of the reasons why one person cheats on the other is because the other one had cheated on them previously. And so if you're going to engage in the process of reconciliation, as I'm describing it, and achieving that type of transparency, part of that transparency is coming to understand not only the way that my action affected you, like getting what it was that I even have done by learning about how my action played out in your life, but you coming to understand why I, as the wrongdoer, acted the way that I did. And so in the kind of messy case that you're talking about, part of the answer to that question might be pulling on this thread that says, well, the reason I did this is partly because you did this thing in the past. That doesn't excuse it or make it okay, but it is a part of the answer, the fact-finding stage of reconciliation, where we're trying to achieve that transparency. So basically, it's like pulling on a thread, and then all of a sudden, we're going to have to talk about other things from our past together that are going to help to make sense of why one person did the thing that they did now. And that leads me to talk about stuff that the other person might have done in the past. So that was a long way of saying, yeah, I think you're exactly right that in those kinds of relationships, we're often going to have to reach into the past and do some fact finding collaboratively together. And often you're going to need somebody to help you with that, a therapist or a religious leader or a trusted friend or somebody like that who can facilitate that ongoing dialogue. It's not a one-off, sit down, have a conversation, and now everything is okay kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess this maybe is a good time to transition to contrasting reconciliation with a couple of things that you say are similar, but importantly different. So you say that reconciliation always involves forgiveness, but reconciliation should be contrasted with both toleration on the one hand and collaboration on the other hand. Can you say a little bit more about how you distinguish these three things and why you think toleration and collaboration don't amount to reconciliation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to understand toleration as being able to kind of put up with or be around somebody without doing violence to them, certainly, but also without needing to lash out or try to cause them harm in some way, respond punitively. And I'm thinking about collaboration in terms of my ability to work with another person and to trust the other person within the confines of the particular relationship that we bear to each other. So thinking of each other as kind of allies working towards some common goal. The problem with collaboration And the problem with toleration is that neither of them are going far enough to rise to the level of what I'm thinking of as reconciliation. Toleration and collaboration are great. Like a lot of the time, that's all you want with somebody. Like if you are coworkers with someone, and you don't want to be friends with them, collaborating with them is awesome. Like you just want to be able to work together, and then you leave the workplace and you don't need to trust that person. You don't need to be able to work together with them once you're not at work any longer. So those are perfectly good states of a relationship. They just don't have they don't pack the kind of normative punch that I think reconciliation does. I take reconciliation to be a pretty robust concept. Like there's a lot that goes into it. So to say that you and I have reconciled is to say that we've done more work and we've kind of aimed higher or gone farther than if you and I are coworkers, we have a big fight, we don't like each other, we're not ever going to be friends, but our boss sits us down and says, all right, Mark and Barrett, like neither of you are going anywhere, so let's figure out a way to all be in the office together. That just doesn't feel as significant as reconciliation does to me.
Mm.
And all of that is importantly distinguished from forgiveness, which for me is a kind of one-sided process. It's describing how I fundamentally feel about the other person, which is different from how I'm able to kind of be around the other person.
Yeah, okay, so this brings us to forgiveness in particular, which you say is sort of part of reconciliation, but not all of it because it's one-sided in this way. And in the chapter, you say that forgiveness is both a practice and an accomplishment, that it's an action that you undertake. So sort of I forgive you or you forgive me, and an outcome that you achieve. So we're now in a state where one has forgiven the other. And you say that the traditional or classic view of forgiveness says that it's about giving up negative emotions like resentment and anger, I guess maybe also indignation, for moral reasons. I found the characterization of the traditional view a little bit hard to follow. And let me see if I can explain why. I'm not an expert on forgiveness, either theoretically or in my own life. But I find this often comes up when I think about accomplishments or virtues, that it's just much easier to become good at the ones where you can practice them. And where wanting to practice them is like reasonable and consistent with having the virtue in question. So think about like generosity. I think it's relatively easy to practice generosity. You just need some resources and people who would appreciate them. And that's almost always going to be the case. Contrast that with like courage. If you really wanted to practice courage the way that people practice the piano or basketball, you'd have to like go around looking for threats and dangers and then overcoming them. And somebody who's like, spoiling for that doesn't seem courageous to me. They seem kind of rash. And I wonder whether forgiveness is also kind of like this. Like, how do we get good at forgiveness? Do we go out of our way to be wronged so that we can practice forgiving? That seems kind of perverse. There are probably some Christian sects that actually do this, but it seems to me like a little bit puzzling and maybe even perverse to go out of your way to be wronged in order to practice forgiveness. So yeah, can you say a bit more about how this traditional view of forgiveness works and how we're supposed to get good enough at this thing that it could count as an accomplishment?
That's a really interesting question. And so two things. First, one of the things that's important for me in writing this paper is that although I want to give the kinds of reasons that would justify or count in favor of forgiveness, I'm not making the stronger moral claim that anybody ought to forgive or thinking about the times when it's a good thing for them to do morally. So I'm wanting to step back from being prescriptive in that way. And part of what that does is open up the space, not to say, like, I'm not necessarily thinking that somebody ought to aspire to be a forgiving person in the same way that I might think someone ought to aspire to be a generous person. That's the first piece. The second piece is, I think you're exactly right that there's something perverse about seeking out the development of particular virtues. And I don't think people should seek out the opportunity to forgive. I think that life will likely afford them the practice that they need to do so. I think that we have lots of small moments as well as big significant moments, but there are lots of chances throughout the day where you're dealing with a colleague or somebody on the subway is rude or something like that, where you just have the opportunity to feel indignation, to feel resentment, and to either hold on to it or to let go of it. And again, stepping back from reaching a judgment that says that there's a definitive answer about when you ought to do that. I think that people, when they kind of pay attention to the way that that plays out for them over time, can likely cultivate that type of active emotional response. And just to be clear, I do think that there are times when someone ought to forgive and when someone ought not forgive. It's just not I don't think that philosophy can tell us in advance of a situation what the answer to those questions will be. I think that what we can do is lay out the kinds of reasons that count in favor of it or against it. And then whichever set of reasons weighs most heavily is what determines what you ought to do. But I want to push back on a view that's, I think, quite common, at least in the States, and I think is often tied to a kind of Christian ethic, which says that you should always be forgiving. I don't think that's true. I think sometimes you shouldn't be forgiving for the reasons that I name in the paper. Did I answer your question though? I think it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I guess the answer is basically life comes at you fast, and there's going to be plenty of opportunities in almost anyone's life to learn to forgive. So you don't need to go out of your way to find these opportunities. I guess this is also to some extent the case with courage. Or at least some aspects of courage, maybe social courage, probably not martial courage. So, if you're actually going to be a war fighter, then probably you're going to have to be put in, systematically put into dangerous and threatening circumstances so that you can learn that kind of courage. But maybe for interpersonal forgiveness, there's enough bad and crappy people in the world that you're inevitably going to cross paths with a bunch of them as you go about your life.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
Not to put too fine a point on it. Okay. So as we think about forgiveness, one question that comes up is like, what sorts of negative emotions does it involve giving up? And you focus in particular on resentment and anger. And I think it would be useful if you could explain a little bit what you understand by the distinction between these two, because sometimes these terms get used kind of interchangeably. And then also if you could say a bit about how resentment sort of paradoxically expresses a form of respect for the resented person, because you might think, at least pre-theoretically, like if you resent someone, you're thinking ill of them, you're not esteeming them, and so that doesn't seem particularly respectful. Can you say a bit more about this?
Absolutely. So I'm just taking resentment and moral anger to be the same thing. So I'm thinking of them as being interchangeable in that way, that part of what is going on when I feel angry with you for having wronged me is that I'm making this additional judgment that the action was wrongful. And I'm also simultaneously recognizing that I'm a person of value who deserve to be treated better. I'm also recognizing you as being a moral agent, as opposed to something like a lightning bolt or a naturally occurring event. So I draw the distinction in the paper between coming home and finding that my house is on fire. I could, two scenarios. One, a lightning bolt burned down my house. The other, an arsonist has burned down my house. in both cases, the harm to me is the same, but in only one of them have I been wronged, unless you think that like Zeus is throwing lightning bolts from Mount Olympus, in which case I should be angry with Zeus. So the distinction is here for me is anger with versus anger that. So I'm angry with the arsonist. I'm angry that the lightning bolt burned down my house. And this is a Straussian insight. Like I'm getting this from Strawson and thinking that my anger is revealing something important about the nature of the action or the event, the fact that it is an action as opposed to a naturally occurring event, and that means that there was an actor behind it. So when I say that anger is actually a form of respect, or it can be, what I mean is not that anger demonstrates that I like the person or that I admire them or want to be around them. What it is doing, it's a kind of Kantian respect that recognizes the actor that wronged me as being a person rather than a thing. So the anger is a way of acknowledging you as someone who can appropriately be held responsible for the thing that you've done towards me. And for me, this is a really interesting insight, because I think a lot of the time we think that anger and respect are anathema or opposed to each other. But I actually think that they go hand in hand in a really important way.
Yeah, I think that's a useful thing to understand. And I guess in the literature, it's sometimes brought out through this contrast between recognition respect on the one hand and esteem respect on the other. So you can respect someone as like an exemplar in their field, right? So, someone's, LeBron James, we respect as a basketball player because he's so good at basketball. That's a kind of respect, but there's this other kind of respect that sort of presupposes that the object of respect is an agent who can recognize reasons, can act for reasons, who's capable of understanding how their actions affect others, and is at least capable of caring about how their actions affect others, even if they don't do so in certain circumstances. So it's that latter kind of respect that you have in mind here, I guess.
That's exactly right. And because I think our emotions, or at least sometimes, going to have a type of judgment packed into them, not all the time, but a lot of the time, then that opens up the space for the kind of recognition, respect that you're describing. I mean, I can also engage, like I can express that type of recognition, respect via other emotional responses too. It's not just anger, but the idea is that emotions are a way of engaging in that recognition, respect, and anger is a particularly good example of it.
Yeah, so I guess gratitude would be like that as well. So, if you just stumble across a windfall that's different from someone giving you a gift, and in the same way that you could sort of feel a sense of gratitude to another person, or feel resentment of another person for what they did. On the other hand, you could just be upset that your house burned down because lightning hit it, or sort of, I suppose, metaphorically grateful to the universe if things work out nicely for you, but no one did anything.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess there's also this idea in Strawson sometimes of taking the objective stance towards other people, and sort of at least treating them for a time as a force of nature, and beyond the pale. This can be dangerous because in a way it's sort of dehumanizing. But I'm curious whether you think this is sometimes the right approach to take. Like if someone has a track record of being callous, not caring when others express resentment and indignation towards them, seems maybe almost constitutionally incapable of taking into account how their actions affect others. Is it sometimes appropriate in circumstances like that to treat them more like the thunderbolts than a human agent?
That's a great question. And I think that it can be, for the same set of reasons that I laid out here in thinking about when forgiveness might be called for. So if I have a coworker who, When talking about moral repair, I think that there are good reasons for thinking about really big, significant wrongs. I know that in your class you're going to be talking about evils, and like if we're talking about someone committing murder or committing violent assault, like those are really significant, dramatic examples that require careful thought. And I also think that there's room for philosophy to help us think about how to function with our coworkers, how to be able to get along with siblings or with family members who are hurtful in important ways. All of that matters, and we may need to be more fine-tuned in how we think about more serious or more less serious wrongs. But I think that that's all kind of fair game for us. So, in answer to the question about the objective attitude, the first place that I go is in thinking about, again, a colleague who I've known for years, who's just kind of consistently thoughtless, consistently a jerk, and has let me down a whole bunch of times. Maybe what's called for, because of the way that I can satisfy my own self-regarding duties of beneficence, would be to just say, you know what, I'm gonna like rise above this person, and I'm just not going to think of them as being a moral agent any longer. That doesn't mean that they aren't owed other kinds of respect, but when they wrong me, I'm just not going to get angry. I'm going to treat the person as if it's a naturally occurring event, rather than letting myself feel the anger or indignation that Strawson describes. So the first answer to the question is like, when should I do that? Is, well, if it would be of benefit to me. Maybe it might be of benefit to the other person. There are times where you might want to say, look, like, I know that this person, it's a hang up for them. They're just kind of, they're struggling with it in some way. So this is a different case. Thinking about a time where a friend of mine just kind of habitually seems to wrong me in a particular way, but they're working on it. And I don't want to write them off altogether. What I might want to do is to say, with regard to this kind of action, I'm just not going to get mad about that anymore. If they're really like a flaky friend who often bails on me at the last minute, leaving me hanging when I'm at the restaurant waiting for them to meet me, maybe I say, look, that's just a kind of a hang up for them, and I'm just not going to get mad about that type of action in the future because they need me to do that. That would be another reason that would justify adopting the objective attitude. Or
So that would be
maybe,
like a kind of local objective attitude where you still think of them as a moral agent broadly, but when it comes to this particular kind of behavior, you say like, okay, that's just something I'm going to bracket off.
exactly right. Yep, I think that that's right. And the same would be true, I don't know, if you're home for the holidays and a parent wants you and your sibling not to fight, for instance. Maybe the fact that you owe it to your parents to like have it be a happy holiday together, maybe that gives you reason to say, again, localized to this particular time period, right? Like the next few days, I'm just not going to get mad when they push my buttons, right? I think
Yeah.
that those are the kinds of reasons that count in favor of adopting the objective attitude. I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to Strawson just across the board, and I think he's right that you can only go so far with that, and that the domains in which you can successfully pull off the objective attitude are going to be constrained. I think a lot of the time they're going to attach to adopting a professional identity. So, for instance, I think it's like I don't in general think that it's appropriate for me to be mad at my students, that my students can be jerks to me in a way that other people might not be, and I don't think that being mad at them is appropriate given the professional role that I play, where like doctors probably shouldn't become angry with their patients in a way that they might outside of that type of professional relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to get to these self-regarding obligations, but before we do, I had one other question about forgiveness.
Sure.
When you say it's unilateral, this sort of, it might throw into doubt the meaning or the importance of practices of apology.
Mm.
Because if forgiveness is something that the wronged person does sort of internally on their own, then at best the apology is sort of a prompt to get them to forgive, but not something that's part of a relationship or part of a longer, more ongoing process between individuals. Do you think that this makes apology superfluous or unnecessary? How does apology fit into your perspective on forgiveness?
Another great question. So I would want to say that so apology is a method of discharging your reparative obligations. So in talking about reconciliation, for instance, one of the criteria for me is that the wronged party engage in moral repair. And so at the least, that's usually going to involve a well-formed apology. But if we're focusing just on forgiveness, which is unilateral, it's unilateral in principle. So it's the kind of thing that I could forgive someone for without anybody else in the world knowing anything about, at least conceptually. In practice, a lot of the time, I'm going to need the person that wronged me to try to make amends for their wrong in order for me to be able to get to the point that I let go of that anger. And apology is one of the main methods by which they might do that. So as it turns out, like contingently on the ground, apology is going to be super useful. It's not, I think you described it as, superfluous insofar as it might be just a mere prompt for forgiveness to follow. But I think that it's not a mere prompt. I think it often opens up space for me to actually then go on to forgive. I don't think it always does. I might want to be able to forgive somebody, as the examples you started us with, somebody who's died or somebody who's not in my life anymore. They haven't had the chance to apologize and never will. And I still want forgiveness to be possible for me, but I'm probably going to need to get some other help in order to do that. Like I might need to go to therapy in a way that I wouldn't, or maybe I wouldn't need to if the person were around and could apologize or try to make amends in other ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess the idea is that you can have apology without forgiveness and also forgiveness without apology, but in a lot of sort of typical circumstances, you'll either have both or neither.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I also would want to distinguish between accepting an apology and forgiving, where I think like you could apologize for a way that you wronged me, and I could say, hey, Mark, I appreciate it. I accept the apology, but I'm still mad at you. I think that that's a conceptually coherent distinction. And part of the reason why I think that's an important one to draw is that we often, again, conflate those things. And so if I say, hey, I accept your apology, you then expect for me not to be mad anymore and might apply pressure to me to do so. And worse, you might expect for us to reconcile or to just say like, okay, cool. So everything's all right now. It's like, no, that's not true. Like I might still want never to see you again. I can accept your apology, communicate that you've discharged your reparative obligation to me, and also completely sever the relationship and walk away. I think that that's, if anybody takes one thing away from this paper, like that's what I'm hoping that people can take away from it.
Great. Okay, so moving on to self-regarding reasons for forgiveness. You talk about sort of prudential reasons like getting over the emotional turmoil of ongoing resentment or anger or sadness or fear. But the definition of forgiveness that you give earlier in the chapter specifically points to moral rather than prudential reasons for forgiving. So I guess one question I had was whether you're sort of surreptitiously expanding the grounds for forgiveness. But then there's also this stuff about duties of beneficence to self. So I guess even prudential reasons can also be moral reasons if you accept the notion of a duty to oneself. I guess there are people who find the notion of duty to self incoherent or at least puzzling. And since you seem to accept it as coherent, maybe you could say a bit more about what you think duties to self are and why it makes sense to talk about them in this context.
Absolutely. So I do want to blur the line between prudential and moral, and I don't, or perhaps just reject it altogether in lots of cases, and to say, I think that once we accept a story about the kind of value of what it is to be a person, so I think that I am worthy of respect and I should be treated well. And as it turns out, I also am able to respect and treat others well. And then it seems like the fact that it's me that's being treated or respected rather than you seems totally irrelevant to me. So if I'm just imagining a kind of, we could tell a story about how I'm treating a person, and we could all think that's terrible. He shouldn't show that kind of disrespect to that other person, or he shouldn't disregard their interests in that way. And then you lift the curtain and find out that it was actually me all along. I'm not sure why the judgment that the poor treatment was immoral would change at that point.
Yeah, I guess it's just a little bit complicated, even in, or maybe especially in the kind of Straussonian framework, because if someone treats you with a lack of recognition, respect, then you might respond to them with resentment. But would you respond to yourself with resentment? Maybe you could. Would you recruit others to be resentful of you for your own lack of self-respect? I suppose you could, but it starts to get pretty paradoxical when we think of it that way. I don't know. What do you think about this?
I think past Barrett has absolutely wronged current Barrett in various ways, and also greatly benefited current Barrett. Like, I think it really makes sense to think of ourselves extending across time in that way, where, yeah, I think that there are times where it's appropriate for me to resent things that I have done to myself, to be mad at myself for ways that I've set myself up to fail on something that I care about, or undermined my current projects, or treated myself badly in a way that, like, I'm now significantly harmed because of choices that I have made in the past. And I think, actually, it's like, I wouldn't say that I should recruit other people to join me in that, but I think I've had conversations with friends or with family where they've said, oh, like, go easy on yourself. And I've ended up kind of arguing, no, like, I'm appropriately mad at myself right now, and you should join me in that judgment. Like, I don't actually want people to be mad at me, but I think that there's something to that idea. Yeah, that I think that if there's an extent to which it's paradoxical, it likely is coming in when focusing just on a particular moment in time.
Yeah.
But when we think of our lives as extending over time, then I think it becomes pretty plausible just to say, look, like, I shouldn't treat myself as being worth less than I am, the same way that I shouldn't treat you as being worth less than you are. I don't feel the force of the idea that it's me that's doing the action diminishes the judgment that the action is wrongful, or that the action would be rightful if I'm benefiting myself.
Yeah, I guess it's still complicated in other ways. Like, you can't demand an apology of your past self because your past self isn't around anymore. And I guess, given your account of reconciliation, that's impossible to have with your past self as well, because it's bound to be unilateral because the past self is gone. So that there are aspects of forgiveness and reconciliation that are just not available when we're thinking about just one individual diachronically. But I guess a lot of the things that are part of our interpersonal practices of forgiveness can still be sort of reconceptualized in self-regarding terms.
And I think everything you said is right, except that I would want to say, like, I definitely couldn't reconcile with myself because it's bilateral, but I do think I could forgive myself for ways that I've wronged myself in the past. So I think forgiveness is on the scene in the way that reconciliation is not.
Right.
And I also think that, like, I do think it would be kind of weird to think of reconciling with yourself, but I don't think that forgiving yourself feels strange at all. In fact, I think that lots of people think that forgiving themselves for what they've done makes a lot of sense, and I think philosophers make it tricky, whereas actually out in the world, that's a thing that people do.
Right. No, sorry. I guess I meant to say specifically demanding an apology of your past self is kind of incoherent. So that part of the forgiveness process, which is not essential to it on your view, but often concomitant with it, is going to have to fall away.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So moving on a bit more. You say that at its most basic, reconciliation is taken to be about rebuilding or building for the first time a kind of healthy relationship between two people in the wake of wrongdoing. And you claim that this really basic notion of reconciliation is kind of too weak. But I wasn't quite sure what the argument for that was, because it seemed to be mostly supported by a rhetorical question. So can you say a bit more about why you think this idea of just rebuilding or building for the first time a healthy relationship is not enough to count as full reconciliation?
So, I mean, ultimately for me, the concept of reconciliation, just the term, feels, as I was saying earlier, like morally weighty. It's normatively laden. It has this kind of oomph to it, where it feels like a thick concept, whereas this feels like a thin concept. And I think that reconciliation deserves that kind of the space to have all the moving parts that I describe. At the end of the day, if somebody wants to call reconciliation building or rebuilding a healthy relationship, full stop, that's fine. And I'll call it schmeconciliation or something similar. And I mean that not in a, I'm not being, cheeky or dismissive. I really don't feel an attachment to the term, but I do think that the particular collection of elements that I've described here are really morally significant. And so the more interesting way to answer your question, or maybe it's not more interesting, you can tell me, but like, so you say, look, I want to reconcile with my friend. And I say, what do you mean by reconcile? And you say, well, I want to rebuild a healthy relationship with them. And I say, okay, cool. What does that mean? Like, healthy is itself also a pretty robust concept. And so as soon as you start to unpack what building a healthy relationship looks like, I think that it's likely that we're going to talk about things like transparency and bearing the right attitudes towards each other and having achieved moral repair. So I think that healthy, what makes that sentence true but thin is that healthy is itself got a lot that gets packed into it. And that's what I'm trying to tease out through the second half of the paper.
Yeah, so I guess, thinking in terms of like a sci-fi example, if we could both just take a pill that made us forget everything that you did to wrong me, and then we just got along from then on, that could count as reconciliation on this thin view. But on your thicker view, that would just be sort of, well, not even toleration, but yeah, it wouldn't rise to the level of reconciliation because the health of the relationship is not something that's been worked through via understanding of the wrong that was done and repair, but rather just sort of chemically induced forgetting.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and I've thought about exactly that case too. Like, we say forgive and forget, and those aren't the same thing. And
they're almost inconsistent, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's weird that that's a phrase, except that I think it kind of betrays the general bias towards pushing people to forgive and to move on and to just have everything like get back to normal, be okay. And I want people to have the resources to not do that if they're not ready to do that, or if it's not appropriate for them to do so. But I think you're exactly.
Who says forgive and forget? Is it the wronged party, the wronging party, or third parties?
I think
I
it's
feel like
both.
it's really third parties.
Yeah, so like if you're, I don't know, like if a parent is mediating between siblings, they might say forgive and forget. Or zooming out, if we're thinking about, in this paper, I'm largely thinking in terms of interpersonal wrongdoing. A lot of people that have thought about reconciliation are doing so more at the level of social groups interacting with each other. So a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is thinking about groups of people that might need to engage in reconciliation. And this is an importantly different phenomenon that I'm describing here. But I think sometimes you see political leaders say things like forgive and forget, or have it be baked into larger systems, like a religious group might say something like forgive and forget. And whenever anybody says that, I think it's a good idea to ask, so whose interests are served by forgiving and forgetting, or rushing too quickly to normalizing relations?
Yeah, so I guess that brings us to the other reading that's assigned for this week, which is the final chapter of Adam Morton's book on evil. He talks about Truth and Reconciliation committees as well, and in particular focuses on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that I guess is internationally best known, the one in South Africa after apartheid. And he thinks that it's important that it's not just a reconciliation committee, that it's a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And he points out that when people went before these committees, as long as they didn't lie, they couldn't be prosecuted for any of the things that they confessed to doing or being a bystander to when they could have intervened and stopped it. So, this includes, murders, multiple murders, torture, disappearing people, just like some of the most awful things humans can do to each other. And the one exception was for perjury. So if you lied knowingly to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, you could be prosecuted for that, but not for anything else. And as you say, your chapter is not about these larger phenomena or these larger kind of social interactions, but I think it's interesting that there's this epistemic dimension to your account and also to what Adam is talking about. So you put it in terms of transparency, getting to a sort of well worked out understanding among all relevant parties of who did what to whom and how it affected them. And it seems like in the South Africa case and maybe in other examples of Truth and Reconciliation committees, that first kind of epistemic step is also there, even if it's at a larger social scale. And intuitively, I can see why that would be important, but it also seems like pouring salt or acid on a wound. And I wonder why, as the sorts of creatures we are, we have this felt need for this epistemic thing when the harm has been primarily moral. Why we feel the need to sort of look evil directly in its face and understand exactly what it is and how it affected us and who did it and why, rather than just saying like, okay, it was bad enough already, I don't need to relive it and see all these gory details.
I think it's a great question. And for me, the answer about why transparency or that kind of epistemic standard is important is that it's necessary for building or rebuilding trust in a relationship. So if we're thinking just interpersonally and you've wronged me, part of why it's important for me to know why you wronged me is because I need to be able to understand what it was that happened. I also need you to understand the impacts of your wrong on me, so that in both cases, I can feel some degree of confidence when you also commit not to doing it again in the future, that you've understood what it was that you did, and that I can understand where it was coming from. I think it would be very hard to trust somebody if you didn't have that degree of communication and mutual understanding. And it doesn't have to be perfect understanding, but understanding enough to kind of be on the same page about what happened for the purpose of moving forward together in the relationship.
So is the idea that I can then predict when you might do it again because I know what your reasoning is like?
Um, I think that the worry that you wouldn't be able to predict when it would come again, or when you might do it again, would plague the relationship in the absence of that kind of understanding. So I'm just thinking about ways to be able to relax in a relationship and feel like you can be vulnerable with another person and trust them not to wrong you. I don't know how you would get to that place in light of some kind of significant wrong without having done that truth telling work and having communicated. So I mean, I think it's a practical thing. I think that if somebody could just jump to a place of trust again, where it wasn't forced trust or false trust, but it was genuine trust, I, I don't know how you would achieve that without the kind of transparency I'm describing.
Yeah. Another kind of case that Morton talks about is interpersonal again. So coming back to something that's closer to your chapter. And in particular, he talks about cases where someone has lost a family member to murder, and it's clear to everyone who the murderer is. There's no sort of detective work to be done. And he asks, what would you as a family member want to happen to or happen with this person who's maybe even confessed to committing a murder against your mother or your sister or your son or something. And he points out that in a lot of thinking about criminal justice, what we want is to get back what's been lost. So if you steal $100 from me, then you give back $100, maybe plus interest or something, then I'm made whole. And because money is fungible, there's nothing that I've really lost anymore. It's like it never happened. And he points out that especially with cases like murder, but probably also in lots of other kinds of wrongs that people can do to each other, like severe bodily injury or rape or other kinds of trauma that can't be undone. There's no way of sort of giving back or making someone whole. And then the question is, okay, so what do we do with the wrongdoer? I mean, one very American solution is you kill them, right? So they took a life, now they owe a life. Sort of eye for an eye kind of reasoning. But as Morton points out, and as lots of other people have pointed out, Gandhi famously with an eye for an eye makes us both blind. You don't get back anything by killing another person just because they took a life. And Morton suggests that maybe in some cases, what the family members of someone who's been murdered would prefer, and even reasonably prefer, is some kind of reconciliation with the murderer, which seems like a lot to ask. So obviously you couldn't impose this on people if they don't want that. But it does seem like maybe in some circumstances, that's the best that could be hoped for. And I'm curious whether your account has a place for that kind of reconciliation that sort of, to some extent, circumvents the criminal justice system, or at least the kind of retributive criminal justice system that most of us kind of operate in.
Absolutely. So I'm quite friendly to restorative justice practices and pretty hostile to retribution or to punitive practices in general. And I think that that it makes a lot of sense to say that in cases of serious wrongdoing like those that you're talking about, trying to fill that hole is not going to, so the hole in my wallet when you've stolen money from me can't be filled when it's serious injury or the loss of life or loss of feeling at home or safe in the world. So trying to just be able to replace those things, as you said, aren't fungible and not easily replaceable. So I think what we have to do as vulnerable beings is reckon with our own vulnerability. And I think that restorative justice practices open up space for people who've been wronged to do that reckoning And a lot of the time it's going to require that the perpetrator of the wrongdoing be a part of that. I don't think that that should be forced on anybody who doesn't want to be a part of it. But I think that there's lots of good evidence for decades now of lots of folks who've been able to go through a restorative justice process for really profound wrongdoing, and to find that to be a much more therapeutic or healing approach than throwing somebody in jail. Also very American practice, or executing them for sure. So all of this definitely points towards stuff that I've argued for in other and forthcoming work, having to do with prison abolition, and thinking that that's the right stance that we should take.
I guess it's a little bit paradoxical, like, if you commit a minor infraction, then we take stuff from you. But if you commit a serious enough infraction, then we try to find a way to reconcile with you. But maybe this is it just feels paradoxical, and it's not. Or maybe it is paradoxical, but because we're the sorts of vulnerable creatures that we are, that's the best we can aim for.
Folks who write about apology have made that same point, and I've made that point that one of the weird things about apologies, it seems like for minor wrongs, it's all that's needed, and for major wrongs, it's all that we'll do. And then we have this middle ground of wrongs where a lot of the time you have to put your money where your mouth is, and an apology is necessary but not sufficient. So if I've stolen from somebody else, I should both apologize to them and pay back the money that I stole with interest. But if one person commits murder, you might think that a well-formed apology within the context of a restorative justice practice might be the only thing that would do the trick.
Yeah, and I guess what it would take for an apology to be well-formed in that kind of circumstance would require so much more work that maybe it's not quite fair to call the apology for stepping on your toe and the apology for murdering your sibling by the same name.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and so whether you want to come up with schmapology or something like that, or just think in terms of apologies for minor versus major wrongs, I think the apology for the major wrong is going to require a lot of the same type of reconciliatory work that I'm describing in the paper. That doesn't mean that reconciliation necessarily follows or should even be the aim, but it seems like part of the elements of reconciliation that I'm describing are also likely to be in a restorative justice circle, for instance.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Barrett. I really appreciate it. And I hope the students found this interesting and thought-provoking.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much.